Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insights and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China's changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the program on U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today we're going to talk about tariffs, a word that President Trump has said is one of the most beautiful ones in the dictionary. And we're really lucky to have Ambassador Susan Schwab, who was the U.S. Trade Representative during the term of President George W. Bush, and currently a strategic advisor to the law firm Mayer Brown, to help us understand everything we need to know about this sometimes complicated, complex topic. Susan, I know you are in much demand these days. Your interviews are blanketing the airwaves, so thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, thank you, Liz. You know I'm a fan.
So let's get to it. On April 2nd, President Trump announced Liberation Day. His administration placed 10% tariffs on all goods coming into the United States, and then additional tariffs at varying rates on goods coming from dozens of countries. Then within a week, he started to give countries a reprieve. Let's start with why he did this. What is his strategy?
So the first, as you said, April 2nd, Liberation Day, I think everyone was caught by surprise about the magnitude. So the reciprocal tariffs sort of with a 10% baseline, and then above that up to, above 30-40%, depending on the country. They're called reciprocal tariffs. They aren't actually reciprocal tariffs. They are based on a formula that has to do with the size of the U.S. trade deficit with that country. And in countries where the U.S. has a trade surplus, and there are a few of them, they get just flat out 10%. So that was how it was constructed. It was a shock to everyone, trading partners, and one has the sense watching the Rose Garden ceremony is a shock to a lot of people in the Trump administration. Certainly the business community and the markets reacted very badly. Very badly. Stock market, bonds, the whole bit, and the president and his team discovered that, yes, in fact, there was a tipping point beyond which you can't go on tariffs without significant disruption in the economy or risking a significant disruption in the economy. And so April 8 came the announcement that these tariffs were going to be suspended for every country except China. For a 90-day period, during which time bilateral negotiations were going to take place to address the challenges, the motivations, the objectives, the priorities that this administration has. Let's separate China for right now. So that list of countries, that list of countries is very significant. It's over 60. The motivations, it's sort of interesting. It depends on who you're talking to, on what day. Let's start with the president's assertion that everyone has. This is a PG-13. Everyone has been unfair to the United States in terms of its treatment of our exports, treatment of our trade. They have treated us unfairly since forever. And we need to get back at them. Motivation 1. 2, motivation, reindustrialization, rebuilding an industrial base in the United States, the assertion that we don't make anything here anymore, which, by the way, is not accurate, but we don't make anything anymore. Trying to use tariffs to increase investment in manufacturing in the United States and manufacturing employment in the United States. Changing behavior of trading partners in terms of their foreign barriers, the objective of raising revenues to help plug the rather significant gap in our federal budget, a variety of other objectives, some of which now show up in the template that the administration appears to be presenting to each of the trading partners. But that gets into both the issues that I addressed and some other issues having to do with how they in some cases, how they treat China, how they treat U.S. exports, specific barriers that show up in the National Trade Estimate report that the USTR puts out once a year. So you sort of take those major motivations and translate them into specific asks of specific trading partners.
So you were, so the whole range of issues, a whole range of ostensible motivations, and maybe some of them coming from different parts of the administration. And we can come back to sort of the views within the administration because they're not uniform, which may...
And they're not necessarily mutually consistent.
Right. That's all right. It's another problem. We'll come back to that in a minute. But you were USTR. Is President Trump really the first president to use tariffs in this way, or have other presidents, how did George W. Bush use tariffs? What was the point, during his tenure? How did he think about them?
Well, I think it's safe to say that President Trump is the first president since, let's say 1934, because I would argue that U.S. trade policy, contemporary U.S. trade policy, really started after 1930, after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, and really started with the Reciprocal Trade Act of 1934. And since then, presidents have used tariffs both in terms of carrots and sticks, but more carrots than sticks, right? Reciprocal trade negotiations, negotiation of bilateral trade agreements, of multilateral, of sectoral trade agreements, using tariffs as a lure. We'll lower our tariffs in areas where you're competitive if you lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers, obviously, in areas where we're competitive. So that kind of negotiation. And then obviously starting in 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and you bring in the concept of most favored nation treatment and non-discrimination and so on. Now, the use of tariffs as a negative motivator, the first major use of that, I would argue, is the first Trump administration. The Biden administration, as you know, didn't lower those tariffs.
Right.
And from time to time, yes, the United States has raised tariffs to force, persuade, encourage a change in behavior by other trading partners, particularly as it impacts U.S. exports. And that is generally through Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, after an investigation as to whether there are acts, policies, and practices that are unreasonable, burdensome, and a whole variety of other terms. But yeah, tariffs have been used that way, but they're sort of scalpel-like, rather than across the board, and based on calculation, based on deficits, rather than based on the value of trade impacted, say, by that trade barrier or by that unfair trade practice. We put up tariffs all the time related to dumped product that's subsidized into this market and injuring U.S. producers. I mean, we use tariffs, but not quite the way they're being used under this administration.
Arguably, the Trump administration, put these tariffs on as a form of leverage, right? Given how quickly, right, within the space of a week, as you mentioned, right, all of a sudden you're getting a reprieve, a 90-day reprieve. So this seems more like, here's the threat of action. Of course, it causes an enormous amount of tumult, as you also pointed out. And then we're giving you 90 days and we're going to negotiate with really no expectation, I don't believe, that the tariffs are going to remain at the high level that they were for many countries. Is that fair, that in essence, these were just a threat, and then, the real negotiation begins and nobody expects that they're going to stay at these levels?
It is a great question. I mean, the real question is what happens July 9, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's 90 days after. The challenge, and this is speaking as a former negotiator, the challenge is they shot the hostage, right? And once you've shot the hostage, that kind of changes the negotiating dynamic. Now, you could argue they showed that they are capable of shooting the hostage, but they backed down. And they backed down for good reasons, by the way. I'm not arguing with that. But it does change the negotiating dynamic somewhat. And so that and the fact that they're never going to be able to negotiate with all of those countries and
Right.
do deals with all those countries before July 9. So there's a question. And let's face it, the uncertainty that all of this creates, whether you're talking about domestic U.S. firms that are thinking about investing, or foreign companies that are thinking about investing, or companies that are making purchase decisions, all that's kind of up in the air because nobody knows what the tariff is going to be.
Right.
No one knows what they're going to be paying. And in some cases, you're talking about tariffs that are, twice the cost of the product in the first place or more.
Right. And then in some cases, I know for countries like Madagascar, right, where they have a surplus of, cloves and vanilla, right? One of the poorest countries on Earth.
Or Fiji.
And you're wondering, what is the point of this,
Fiji
really?
water or Lesotho. I mean, little, small, poor countries that, are trying to make it in a tough trading world, and we might have given them trade preferences 10 years ago, and now the administration slaps a tariff on them and they don't know what hit them. And oh, by the way, the administration isn't going to have time to negotiate with them anytime soon. So they're facing the prospect of real chaos unless the pause is extended for them. It's not their fault they're not getting an audience with USTR.
Right. And I guess that begs the question as well. I mean, it does seem as though there are just some differences of opinion within this administration. Not everybody seems to be aligned. I think, Kevin Hassett, for example, has written, for years about tariffs not particularly favorably. So how do you sort of understand the dynamics of the administration? And do you think that has contributed to some of the chaos that we seem to have experienced in this process?
Well, each president runs their operation, runs their cabinet the way they choose to run it. I was I was blessed by working for George W. Bush, who was a terrific boss, and you could tell he had been a CEO. You knew your red line. I felt very empowered as a negotiator. I knew my red lines. I would sit down with my, say, Chinese counterparts who had to phone home for every single decision that they had to make, whereas we sat at the table and we could wheel and deal because we knew we could be innovative and creative in the structures we came up with, and we knew what the red lines were. We knew what our objectives were. We were empowered, and our marching orders generally were get the best deal you can, and if it's a bad deal, you walk away. And I did both as USTR. I got some good deals, and I walked away from bad deals. So the current team, there is only one decider, right? And that is the president. And he is delegating up to a point, but no further. And I think I have the sense that they're settling into a rhythm, and they're settling into who has what responsibility, right? So you have Secretary Bessent and Jameson Greer as the lead in the China talks at this point. You have Secretary Lutnick and as Ambassador Greer on all the other negotiations. I think it's pretty safe to say that most of the work is being done at USTR. And the interagency process, experts at the Commerce Department, experts at the Agriculture Department, experts at the Treasury Department. And that's the way that interagency process has always worked. What they don't know is, and nobody knows at the end of the day, what is going to be satisfactory and what else the president's going to want.
Right. And we've seen the deal with the UK and now a big investment deal with Saudi Arabia, investment and trade deal with Saudi Arabia. How do you evaluate these deals? I mean, the president, of course, has called them successes, big successes. I mean, as a U.S. trade negotiator, do you see these as successes? From where we started to what we got, do they seem like successes to you?
Well, if you're talking about, I'm not familiar at all with the Saudi deal at this point, except that obviously the United States has always been, or certainly has been in the contemporary decades, a really good place to invest. And that has been evident by the amount of foreign direct investment, both in terms of stock and flows. And the key is not to screw that up. And I think the president wants to be a part of encouraging that or forcing that. And he declares victory when he has done that. We'll see how the press releases translate into actual investment. Some of that investment is going to come in slowly. We know that it takes a long time to build factories or retool factories. It takes a long time to hire people, particularly when you've got skill deficits in the United States. But those are to be applauded if they come through. In terms of some of the other elements, there's the fact that they are negotiating agreements. I mean, I give them credit in terms of the UK deal. There is some substance there. There's a whole lot of work to be done. And I give both sides credit in terms of the UK deal for having got as far as they did. But the devil is always in the details, and they're going to have to work those out. And we'll see. The last we've heard is that Switzerland is up on the list. The EU is not so far up on the list. They are negotiating. I don't know what the latest count is, but with at least 20 countries, where negotiating seems to be defined as the country has to not have retaliated, has to come in with a proposal. Then the U.S. hands them the template with the specific asks, and that may be remove these barriers, again, from the National Trade Estimate Report. Perhaps some purchase agreements.
Right.
Perhaps some, encouraging foreign direct investment, actions to reduce the trade deficit, but that's hard to do. I mean, because governments can't, commit to that. But if there are concerns about currency manipulation, commitments on currency manipulation, and in some cases, it's quite clear concerns or actions to address concerns about Chinese overcapacity finding its way into third country markets and then coming to the U.S. And those are going to be harder for some countries than others. But that seems to be one of the kinds of things that shows up or is being asked in these agreements. There are also some really interesting things on the digital front. Some of which appear to be getting, some of which they aren't necessarily getting. That was still a standoff in the UK case, digital services tax, which we have a real problem with. But they've agreed to have a digital technology forum, BILAT, and if they can come up with a deal there, that'd be terrific too.
Yeah, I think that was one of the points that they said we're going to move forward right on trying to come up with some kind of digital trade agreement, which would be, I think, terrific. But that would represent a real step forward. And as for the Saudi deal, I would just say it's a lot of investment. The trade seems to be mostly in purchases of defense equipment, military equipment by the Saudis, but a lot of Saudi investment here and some investment by our tech companies there, and worth apparently $600 billion, although, again, to your point about what actually materializes, there's some that, could take a long time, and there's also some that's already underway that they've just kind of included. As we both know from working on these kinds of, statements in the U.S. government, you try to take advantage of things that may also already be in the works, and it's clear there's some of that wrapped up in this as well.
And the thing to remember about the UK deal is the first Trump administration worked very hard on a bilateral trade agreement. I mean, like a full-scale, comprehensive trade agreement with the UK. So they put in several years on that, and they had that available to them as a template, a blueprint that they could draw on for this current negotiation. And people on both sides who had been involved in those negotiations, namely Jameson Greer and Amanda Brooks on the UK side, among others.
And they're back again, right?
And they're back again. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so they have the opportunity now to move things forward. So that is, I think, a very positive sign. So let's spend a minute on China. As you mentioned, USTR Greer, Ambassador Greer, and Treasury Secretary Bessent, they were in Switzerland with their Chinese counterparts. They came to some accord. Huge reduction in the tariff levels on both sides, so that now for the next 90 days, it's sort of 30%, I think, in terms of Chinese goods coming into the U.S. and 10% on U.S. goods going into China. And the Chinese removed all of the non-tariff measures that they'd put, I think, critically for us on the critical minerals, rare earth elements. But the narrative seems to be...
Let me offer just one caveat.
Go ahead. Sure, absolutely.
It is, if you look at the press releases, it is the U.S. And China dropping the tariffs that they imposed on April 2nd by 115%.
Right.
So it's not a 30% tariff. It is on the U.S. side 30%, 10 plus the 10% baseline, the 20% fentanyl. On the Chinese side, 10% on top of what was in effect on April 1st.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So we're talking about tariffs that can go well in excess of 30%.
Okay.
On which side. And then there were some changes in de minimis that had, again, we went from prohibitive, as they referred to it as effectively an embargo,
right,
to high but not prohibitive, in depending on the product,
right,
depending on the product, depending on the sector, there will be some resumption of trade.
So that's a very important distinction. Thank you for that. So people are saying, or the media, I would say, the general narrative has been that somehow China won, that Xi Jinping standing tough, standing firm, that actually China came out ahead. Is that how you read this?
Not really. I sort of read it as both of them finally came to their senses and sent some adults to Geneva to talk.
Yeah.
Why? We were in an absurd situation where the fact that neither one wanted to make the first call at the leader level was just utterly absurd, while both economies were feeling significantly negative impacts. For God's sakes, just sit down and talk. And they finally sent some adults to do that.
Right. Yeah, my sense was that both leaders recognized that the real hurt was about to hit. And if they take action now, there's going to be some serious problem. Yeah.
You're aware more than most, the extent to which so many of China's exports to the U.S. Are actually small, medium-sized enterprises that can't last that long. There's a limit to how long people are going to be able to hang out not producing things and not getting money and having contracts canceled, because these tariffs are across the board, not just on across the board, not just on critical items.
Right. And I think the Trump administration, for its part and to its credit, recognized that, no matter that the president says, you can have $2 instead of $30, this was, going to affect a lot more than that in terms of consumer prices for American families, and that this, was going to have significant negative impact on the U.S. economy. And we're already seeing in terms of the, shipping and containers and just the whole supply chain really, I think, was, under threat.
Exactly.
So many different parts of the U.S. economy would be hit, not even just the U.S. consumer. So I think, for both sides coming together, I think it was time. So, what about if we're focusing on China, what about the longer term benefits of what the president is trying to do, or the longer term costs? I mean, if you were sitting, with him or sitting with Jameson at this point, what would you recommend moving forward now? What would you say? This is really how I would try to structure a deal, or here's where I think there's room to actually get something useful from the Chinese. What do you see as the opportunity at this point? What do you see as the risk?
So I guess I would say, the Chinese have been decoupling for over a decade, and we need to be more strategic about what we're doing. You can call it decoupling in strategic areas. You can call it de-risking, as the Europeans are. But the fact of the matter is the Chinese have been doing it, and we have not. There was some effort in under your tutelage, under Secretary Raimondo, and on in a couple of sectors, but not generally on the trade side. And it was interesting to hear Jameson Greer comment that there wasn't even there were no bilateral conversations going on between USTR and their Chinese counterparts over the last several years. So
Yes.
not
I have to say, at the Commerce Department, we had discussions going on the U.S.-China business relationship, and Treasury had those discussions. But quite right that USTR really hadn't established any sort of channel of communication with their counterparts.
right. And you need a whole of government approach. And you really need, if you're going to do it right, you're going to need a whole of government approach. And so that's, a second piece of advice, which is you got to figure out what your priorities are. And that's what you target. And dolls, I'm not sure dolls is it. Apparel, footwear, you got to figure out what is it that we can be trading with each other. And that's going to be in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars that I was going to say nobody cares about, but a lot of people care about. They're good for both sides. Whereas those aspects of the trading relationship that by one definition or another are sensitive in terms of security, whether on the import side or the export side. And those are the ones we need to be focused on. So that would be really my first piece of advice, is figure out what matters and what doesn't matter and just focus on that. The second piece of advice, so the first piece of advice might actually be taken seriously. The second piece of advice is we really need our allies on board on this.
Yeah.
And, you can't, I'm not going to pretend you can dial back the clock, but I would hope in the context of negotiations with other trading partners as we try to address the existing tariffs, or the situation we find ourselves in, or they find themselves in with the bilaterals that will be going forward, that a premium is placed on how to address the China relationship, both in terms of how we and our trading partners behave, but also how to reinforce the trading system, the WTO, the GATT rules, to make sure that it's not just the U.S. alone, or not just the U.S. and Japan or the EU alone, but that there are a whole lot of countries out there that are really unhappy with China and China's trading practices, whether it's the coercive side, whether it's the fact that all they're doing is shipping raw materials to China. Yeah, China's their biggest trading partner, but it's because China is a market for their raw materials.
Right.
And they would rather be adding value and adding more skilled labor on their side. So they don't want to be China's plantation. And I think there's room for reinforcing rules that are agreed and enforced multilaterally and plurilaterally, multi-country agreements among the willing. I would take us back to CPTPP. That's not going to happen, but something like that, where we have countries that have the same concerns that we do cooperating. Doesn't have to be a formal agreement, but I would put that higher on the list, I think, than some of the tariffs per se. And then third, the sooner you can get certainty into the markets, the better, because then the sooner businesses can do the kind of investing that the administration would like. And finally, visas, work visas, particularly skilled, H-1B visas, skilled labor visas. And that includes visas for people in trades where we have not been able to and can't find the bodies to do the welding or other trades. So not displacing U.S. workers, but finding workers to take on those jobs in those factories where we've run out of U.S. workers. So those would be my recommendations.
So let me pick up on a couple of points. I think on the sort of more proactive trade policy, which has been, I think, lacking over the past 8 years, hasn't even it's not even something new. I think we can agree. Do you see that happening? A wholesale reform of the WTO? Do you see a way in which China is involved in a new, or if not, do you see a way that China is involved in any sort of new trading regime? Or do you really think, realistically, that we can only have trade agreements now among like-minded, democratic partners or, countries that are at least operating with the same level of, labor standards and corporate governance and, market openness? I mean, is there a way that China actually is in a global trading regime and we're in it at the same time?
So I think, first of all, that we've done a lousy job. We, over, as you say, a decade of taking China to the WTO and filing cases against China that are winnable cases. Everyone focuses on the dispute settlement, the appellate body, and that's been a diversion as far as I'm concerned. The GATT worked pretty well before the WTO and before there was an appellate body. And we need to be running up the score and showing that China is in fact violating a whole lot of things that China committed to do when they joined the WTO. I think we just need to be showing that over and over and over again, because China keeps saying they're the good guys and they're the multilateralists and they're, they want partnerships and all that. And then I'm sorry, that's not how they behave in real life. So that would be the first thing. And I think WTO is very useful for that. And I think negotiating through the WTO, you can smoke out the Chinese.
Okay. That's, I think, a really important point, because I'm not sure that's the general sort of feeling in Washington these days. I think, the arguments, I was just, in DC last week and at a meeting where there was a lot of trade discussion. And I would say that overall it was about, sectoral trade agreements or, a CPTPP type agreement, but a sort of throwing up the hands, like forget about the WTO, I think was really the general sense of the room.
I think there is value to be placed in plurilateral sectoral agreements. I think there is value in regional agreements or plurilateral agreements that are like CPTPP among willing countries. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. The WTO has particular benefits. And there's certain things that you cannot do bilaterally, and you cannot do with small agreements, and you cannot necessarily do sectorally. So things like protecting intellectual property. And there are certain things that you can only do multilaterally that isn't going to bother anybody if you do them well. And having China and the U.S. in the same agreement, the fisheries agreement, trade facilitation agreements. Those are things that you really want to have multilaterally. But it may be that if you're going to do a deal on, let's say, pharmaceuticals or medical equipment, and you want to make sure you got supply chains that are going to be there and operating and reliable sources of supply the next time you have a pandemic, it may be that you're not going to have China as part of that group. Or maybe you are going to have China as part, but you need to have the option. So I think you can do sectorals in parallel. You can do regional deals in parallel with the WTO. But I wouldn't abandon the WTO. We would have to reinvent it if it didn't.
I think that's a really important statement. So maybe you need to get that out there a little more. I don't think, I just don't think that's the tenor of the conversation right now. But let me ask you one more question on the U.S.-China trade relationship, just the bilateral relationship, because it seems to me that you raised the point of, where are we between de-risking and decoupling? We need to have a strategy for what it is that we want to do. I mean, a big part of what President Trump has said that he wants to get done is to sort of rebalance the, $300 billion or more trade deficit that we now have with China. Treasury Secretary Bessent has said that's going to take a couple of years. I mean, do you see that as even realistic, given the current state of what we export to China, what China exports to us? And in fact, if we are looking to strategically decouple, that could end up taking, many more U.S., high-tech products sort of off the table in terms of our exports to China. So is that idea of rebalancing the trade deficit, do you think it's realistic at this point?
Yes and no. Yes, to the extent that the actions in the first Trump administration started that process. And companies said, okay, the U.S. doesn't want to import as much from China. And therefore, companies moved manufacturing and moved sourcing to other countries, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Thailand. And then the second Trump administration comes in and is focused on bilateral trade deficits from every country. And the companies that did what they thought they were being told to do in the first Trump administration are discovering they're facing all these big barriers, these tariffs now. So I think if you're really serious about addressing the U.S.-China trade challenge, you've got to be taking seriously friendshoring. You got to be taking seriously nearshoring, which I would argue neither the first Trump administration nor the Biden administration really did. And
I have to say, we did try. We built it into Chips and Science, actually. So there were some efforts at near and friendshoring. But go ahead.
Okay. And I think that has to be part of the strategy. You're right, absolutely right. It takes an extended period of time. We need to focus very heavily on making sure that the U.S. is the place where companies want to invest and where the R&D and the creativity and the innovation takes place organically, right? That has to do with looking after university R&D. Right. It has to do with looking after NIST. It has to do with looking after a lot of things that draw individuals from all over the world here to invest their time and effort and make money and create companies and create wealth for all Americans and, quite frankly, others in the world as well. So I think you would have to differentiate between the China bilateral trade deficit and the rest of the world, and where you would prioritize how those countries interact with China, as opposed to the level of the bilateral trade deficit between those countries and the U.S.
Right. So China becomes the strategic objective, right? Dealing with China and that particular economic challenge, trade challenge, becomes the primary objective, and everything else, you're arguing, becomes in service of that to some extent.
Yeah, and the ideal, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily realistic, the ideal is that China starts getting nervous that this actually is going to work and that they are going to have to stimulate more domestic demand,
right,
and or play by the rules, and they become a more responsible stakeholder.
Right. Right, which, I think to your earlier point about the fact that there are many countries who are concerned about Chinese economic practices, including their export of their overcapacity. It's not simply the United States and Europe and Japan, but now it's a lot of middle-income economies, India and Brazil and Argentina and Mexico as well, who don't want to see their nascent industries in areas like, EVs and batteries and medical devices and every other made in China 2025 technology. They don't want to see them, sort of squashed before they are even given a chance to develop. So I think you're right. There's an opportunity, if managed properly, to work with others and to hold China accountable, and that these countries, in effect, when China sees their pushback, it's a very different dynamic, I think, frankly, from simply feeling as though it's the United States trying to contain us when they've got, other partners, countries they can generally consider to be their partners, saying, these types of economic practices are not okay. So maybe that is also another type of pressure that China is going to feel that could cause it to change some of its behaviors.
Yep, precisely.
So I always finish with a couple of just quick questions to get your thoughts. You've been looking at China for many, many years. What is it that you think we don't know enough about China? What, when you're working on China, when you're thinking about it in the trade context or more broadly, what do you wish somehow that you knew more about?
I wish that I knew more about, and the U.S. government knew more about, or had a way to know more about, the individuals, the Chinese individuals who really would rather be here, be educated here, be citizens here who are not and would never be a national security threat. Similarly, the capital flight and the technology flight generated by those individuals and those companies that do not pose a national security risk. And in our zealousness and I don't know if that's a word, in our well-founded concern about national security, I think we are losing a major bet in terms of Chinese citizens and Chinese companies, private companies, that would much rather be here than there. And the Chinese are not missing that bet because they are doing everything they can to keep those companies and those individuals from exiting. And that should tell us something. And I wish I knew more about how one could differentiate. So that's...
Well, I'll give a small plug to a project here at Hoover, actually, that's being run by one of my colleagues, Glenn Tifford, on research security, where they are looking at the sort of university and the types of research that many scholars are doing in the scientific fields in China and tracking them to see, which ones are not actually tied to military institutes or security or the security apparatus, so that you can have a degree of comfort with the majority of Chinese scientists who would like to partner or would like to work here. And I think this again speaks to the earlier point you made, that we need a sort of a holistic ecosystem if we're going to be able to compete with China. We need to have the talent that we need, the innovation, the industry, the manufacturing, etc. And foreign talent, Chinese and otherwise, is going to be a big part of that. And funding our research universities and our labs and our institutes like NSF and health are critical to that. So I think we have a small project underway, and you can check it out when it's a little bit further along. Because I think and I'm hopeful that it will help to give peace of mind to scholars and government officials about the fact that most Chinese do not come here to study and learn and spy at the same time. Okay, book, article. What have you read recently or not so recently that you think would be great for Americans to read about China?
So you may laugh at this, and it's not specifically about China.
Okay.
But I think it would be very helpful if American policymakers, business people, and even average Americans were to read a book that was written in 1991, I think, by Peter Schwartz called Art of the Long View. And it is a book I go back to periodically. And it was sort of the origin of scenario planning. I think Peter now I think is affiliated with Salesforce. He's a futurist, but it makes you think about how you do scenario planning and think about scenarios that you would never have thought of before. And if there were ever a time for us to be doing that as individuals, as businesses, as governments, this is it. So I go back to The Art of the Long View, and I recommend it a lot. I don't even know if it's still in print. I hope it is.
Terrific. I'm sure I can find it, and I'm going to take that recommendation. It's not. I don't usually I get a China book or article that I've already read and say, oh, it's a good idea. But now you've given me something new. So thank you. All right. Last question. We know that President Trump, has someplace inside him a desire to have a big deal with Xi Jinping. He'd like to meet with Xi Jinping. What are the odds that President Trump and President Xi have a kind of Nixon, Kissinger, Mao, Zhou Enlai moment and achieve some kind of breakthrough for the U.S.-China relationship over the next, 3.5 years? 1 to 10.
I think the odds are pretty good. I look at, and I think that's good and bad, by the way.
Okay.
I think the odds are pretty good. I give President Trump a whole lot of credit for USMCA, the Canada-Mexico-US deal that no other president could have done, and no other president could have gotten through Congress. And I hope they don't mess it up now, because it was a really good deal, and there's some risk that they will mess it up. In terms of the Kissinger, the Nixon goes to China moment, I think that's something that would appeal to President Trump, probably would appeal to Xi Jinping. I just would hope it's not in the context of us selling out.
Yeah. Okay. So, Susan, thank you so much for your frankness, for your equanimity. I think kind of helping to steer us, give us a clear path forward, I think is really useful at these times when, we're constantly besieged by what just seems to be, it's one piece of news after another. It's very difficult to make sense of it all, I think. But you've really, I think, contributed, not just through this podcast, but I think more broadly to helping people understand, what's going on and where this might all go. So thank you again for your time.
Liz, thank you very much, and keep doing what you're doing, because it really is teaching all of us things we need to know.
So if you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more reasoned discourse and debate on China, I encourage you to subscribe to China Considered via the Hoover Institution YouTube channel or podcast platform of your choice. Our next China podcast